Good evening. I'm Don Sparks, the director of the Delaware Environmental Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another conversation in our DENIN Dialogue series. It's truly an honor to have Dr. Daniel Hillel here with us tonight. He is the recipient of the 2012 World Food Prize, considered to be the Nobel Prize of Agriculture, and he is certainly highly deserving of the honor. Dr. Hillel's seminal work to develop micro-irrigation techniques is in itself a worthy achievement. He demonstrated that water applied in small but continuous amounts directly to plant roots resulted in dramatic increases in both plant production and water conservation. But in addition to his scientific work, Dr. Hillel has throughout most of his life served as a tireless ambassador for sustainable agriculture. The practices that he and others developed through their research, such as drip irrigation, have been widely adopted throughout the world and impacted the lives of millions of people, largely through his efforts. He has served international agencies and organizations such as the World Bank, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, and promoted water use efficiency as a consultant to the governments of dozens of countries in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and South America. He has written or edited 26 books, some of which are on display in the front lobby on the roles of soil and water in healthy agroecosystems. His latest work is Soil in the Environment, Crucible of Terrestrial Life. He is currently a senior research scientist at the Center for Climate Systems Research, part of the Earth Institute of Columbia University, and is working on the adaptation of agriculture to climate change in association with NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Dr. Hillel will be interviewed tonight by Robin Morgan. Dr. Morgan hails from North Carolina, where she attended Meredith College. She completed her graduate work at the Johns Hopkins University and conducted postdoctoral research at the University of California at Berkeley. She joined the faculty of the University of Delaware's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources in 1985 and very effectively served as dean of that college from 2002 to 2012. Please join me now in welcoming Daniel Hillel and Robert Morgan.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, I'd also like to extend a welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to see you tonight, and we are going to have a conversation. The way this is going to work is Dr. Hillel and I are going to, I'm going to ask questions, he's going to answer them for roughly 45 minutes to an hour. And after that time, we're going to open the floor up for your questions. So as we are talking, it's important that you make mental notes or make some notes about the questions that are rising in your minds and the things we are not answering, because I do want to give you plenty of time to ask questions of Dr. Hillel. So thank you also for being here with us and spending these few days here at the University of Delaware.
And thank you for hosting me.
And I think we'll get started by laying a firm foundation. So I'd like to ask you this. What is soil? When I say the word soil, what comes to your mind?
Much comes to my mind. Soil is the living outer portion of the Earth's continental surface. It is where the atmosphere and bedrock and rain and snow and heat and cold impact and gradually over time disintegrate the exposed surface of the rocks forming the mantle of the soil, of the land, and then churning that into particles, gradually infusing with air and water, and lo, life begins. And life taking place in the soil works the soil, churns it, develops it, and so in conjunction with the earth's mantle and the atmosphere and the sun and the rain and the initiation of life, we get the living portion of the earth's continental surface, which may not be more than about a yard deep, sometimes deeper, sometimes shallower, but it is the fount of life. It is where life is generated and sustained. That's soil.
Thank you. That's great. Now, others have recognized your work on drip irrigation, as Dr. Sparks just pointed out. And this contribution is cited as the major reason that you won the World Food Prize. When you gaze back across the decades of your life, what do you think is the most important contribution you've made?
It's a difficult question to answer.
Well, you can always say drip irrigation.
I could, but over the many decades of my professional life, and I can say that's about 6 decades by now, I'm ancient, you see, I have worked in research and worked in application and spent quite a bit of my early years after gaining a graduate degree from an august American university and fancying myself a complete scientist. I ventured back to the Middle East, where I spent my childhood, and in the state of Israel, then in the very early stages of its development, I was given the task of surveying the country's soils and learning about the agricultural potential of development there. And so I had the opportunity to literally traverse the country north to south and east to west, measure the soils and its connection with vegetation. And the land was then in a state of deterioration after centuries of neglect. It had been eroded, it had been abused, in some places waterlogged, in other places excessively dry and salinized. And so the task for the early state of Israel, way back in the late 40s, early 50s of the last century, the notion was to map the country's soils and determine how to develop the land. And I had the extraordinary opportunity of traveling through the country, measuring the soil, working with some of the great leaders of the soil conservation movement from the United States, and I'll mention Walter Clay Loudermilk as one of them, the outstanding soil scientists of the day. I had earlier studied at Rutgers University under Verminy Baer and Jacob Joff and Selman Waxman. These were inspiring scientists to me. And so I ventured into this country, the land of Israel, toured the whole country, and then joined and mapped it in terms of soil. And then I joined with a small group of pioneers, I would almost say daredevils, and we ventured down into the desert region and established the first agricultural settlement in what was then very arid desert, and trying to bring life to a lifeless region. Those were early seminal experiences in my life.
Very good. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about climate change and feeding the world of the future, things that I know you think a great deal about and that I'm anticipating the audience has a great many questions about. So first, feeding the world. Given that the world's population is projected to exceed 9 billion people by mid-century, and may reach 10 billion by the turn of the century. By the way, 9 billion people in 2050 is less than 40 years from now. So those of you who are young in the audience, you're going to live through this. Given this population explosion, how will it be possible to produce enough nutritious food to feed the world?
It will only be possible, and that's conditional, if we manage the resources, the life-giving resources of the earth, judiciously, responsibly, not only conservatively, but constructively. If we enhance the productive potential of the ecosystems that we are trying to manage. We have not done a very good job over the recent centuries. We've caused a lot of erosion, degradation, waterlogging of some areas, salination or salinization of other areas. We have to improve the way we deal with ecosystems, with the natural vegetation, with the soil. We have to intensify our management of selected tracts of land. Intensify in a sustainable way, not merely sustainable, but constructive way, in a way that will improve the productive potential. And we must withdraw from exploiting areas that are vulnerable to erosion or salinization or degradation of one sort or another, or pollution. We have done a poor job in the past. We have to improve that. It is absolutely imperative that we learn better ways and we manage the soil and the vegetation and the climate. You mentioned the climate. We have begun to change the climate by changing the composition of the atmosphere, spewing out into the atmosphere gases such as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and methane, gases that trap heat and are causing the gradual increase in temperature. We have to control that. We can no longer consider the management of the land and the vegetation in piecemeal manner. We can no longer think that I have a farm so I can do anything I want on it. Or we have a country so we can do anything we want in our country. We're living in a single globe. It's all integrated. The atmosphere envelops all of us. The climate change is going to affect the entire globe. Not a single nation will be able to escape the consequences of our mismanagement. So we have to think globally and act globally to preserve and to enhance the productive potential of selected tracts of land and water resources and energy resources, and prevent pollution and degradation, intensify production on selected tracts, and allow the rehabilitation of natural ecosystems, because we live in a mutually dependent world. Think globally and act globally and responsibly and cooperatively.
With regard to climate change and where we are right now, we are, as a world society, in the uncomfortable position of having to take action without having a complete understanding of the problem. Given the current situation and what we know and what we don't know, what do you think we should be doing right now as a world society?
Well, the fact that we don't know what we don't know requires that we learn more, but it also requires that we employ what is called the precautionary principle, that we be careful in managing to prevent us from stumbling unknowingly, blindly into a terrible situation. There are dangers, and as we change the composition of the atmosphere, we're increasing the retention of heat at the surface. This increases, of course, the evaporative demand. It changes the relationship between the zonation of agriculture and of natural vegetation. So we have to be very, very careful about this, and we have to cooperate globally in doing a much better job than we've done so far. We have abused the earth. Now, I want to point out that we named ourselves Homo sapiens, and that's a pretentious name. Homo means of the earth, of humus, and sapiens means wise. So we flatter ourselves thinking that we're wise earthlings. We haven't been very wise in the past. We have to get wiser. And the way to become wiser is to appeal to young people and introduce them to the problems and to what we know and what we do not sufficiently know, and challenge young people to do a better job managing the earth. That's a wonderful opportunity to speak to university students who are going to be responsible for the future.
I want to ask you about waste. So when you consider food production, and I mean everything from the preparation of the soil and the planting of seed to post-meal garbage disposal, what would you estimate the percentage of food waste to be?
I don't exactly know what the figures are, but they're very high. And in this country, the United States, which is my birthplace, and I'm very proud, and I've always been, shall always be, to be American by birth. But we also have to be critical of ourselves. This country is wasteful. So is Western civilization in general. And we generate a lot of waste, and that waste pollutes land resources, water resources, and there's even seeps into rivers and is carried into the ocean, the sea, the ocean. And so we're degrading the earth by being wasteful. We have to consider ways, and there are ways, to generate less waste, to recycle the waste, to turn it from a burden to a resource, to a productive resource. There are ways to treat, to minimize garbage and sewage and so on, and to capture what is inevitably waste and recycle it. Much of it can serve to increase the productivity of ecosystems, particularly in agriculture. So there are promising ways of turning a negative into a positive.
talking about the link between production agriculture and energy conservation. We know that in the last century, agricultural advances were amazing, but they were also costly in terms of energy use. We use a lot of fossil fuels in the process of doing production agriculture in a modern way. How can we continue to intensify agriculture in the future without using more fossil fuels and contributing greater to that problem? Can you give us some examples of practices that have already been developed in some parts of the world of necessity that, if they were broadly applied, might be part, even if they were small parts, of the solutions we seek? Some examples of practices that already exist.
Well, to begin with, agriculture, by its nature, is an energy producer. Plants conduct photosynthesis. They absorb radiant energy from the sun and use that energy to combine water which is absorbed by the roots, and a gas called carbon dioxide, which is absorbed by plants in their leaves, little openings in the leaves called stomates, absorb carbon dioxide, synthesize it with water derived from the soil, and create sugars and starches and proteins and all of the other materials of life. So here is a wonderful opportunity to enhance photosynthesis, but also to use other sources of energy much more efficiently. Radiant energy from the sun can be absorbed not only by plants, but by photoelectric cells. We can generate electricity that will allow us to process agricultural production, agricultural products. And so other sources of energy are geothermal energy, hydraulic energy, tidal energy. All of these are potentially useful. So management of energy, as well as management of waste, management of the land, management of the waters, all of these things interlink, and we have to do a much better conjunctive job managing the resources of the earth sustainably. That's a key concept. Not to waste, but to sustain. And even beyond that, to enhance, we can do that.
I want to ask you about finding solutions that are fair, considering differences around the world. So many of the people who study climate change and talk about feeding the world have never been hungry a day in their lives. Is it possible to fairly control and remediate climate change when there are such big differences between the developed world and the developing world?
It must be possible. It must be possible because we cannot isolate ourselves as part of the developed world and set ourselves apart from the remainder of humanity. We're all interlinked. The atmosphere is the same atmosphere, and it mixes itself regionally, globally. So are the waters, and even the production of food, the distribution of food, the trade. Everything is interlinked today. We cannot isolate ourselves. We do not live in a fortress, not in this country, not in Europe, versus Africa or Asia, or South America. It is all interlinked. We're We are our brothers and our sisters' keepers, and they are our keepers. We're a single humanity. We've taken over the earth, and now we have to manage it well and sustainably, and we can do that. We can do that. I'm sure that in this audience there are students I have seen in this campus, students from many countries around the world. And what unifies us all is the quest for knowledge and for betterment of the earth. So, a university is a good place to start. This is where people come together in search of knowledge and understanding, and to begin constructive careers cooperatively. It used to be, once upon a time, that science was practiced individually, that people could isolate themselves in little laboratories and do science apart from others. That's no longer possible. It's all interlinked. And a university, by its name, university, is a good place to start, to generate this spirit of cooperation, responsibility, research, development, understanding, and action.
You have addressed students in your answer, and you've spoken a lot about students and how they are hope for the future. Could you spend a few minutes telling us about experience that you had when you were a student, or individuals who influenced you? What's your story?
I am a student.
Okay.
I'm a lifelong student. I've never stopped being a student. Mm-hmm. And I suggest that none of us ever stop being a student. Learning. Mm-hmm. A wise person once said, I think it was Ben Jonson, that the history of humanity is a contest between learning and disaster. If we stop learning, we'll encounter disaster. It's like imagine driving a vehicle into the darkness, not knowing what's ahead. Now we have to learn. It's a lifelong task. It never stops. If you think you're going to graduate in 2 or 3 or 4 years from college and stop learning, you're wrong. If you think that college will initiate a lifelong process of learning is a cooperative venture, then you're in for an interesting and constructive career and lifetime of interest and vitality, and that's what I truly recommend, learning.
Can you tell us a story about someone who influenced you as you were developing your career?
I had a number of very important influences in my life. I can mention people who influenced me deeply. Some of my teachers. In early life, I had marvelous teachers who had, the story of Israel, and I grew up my childhood in Israel when it was only in the very early stages. It was not yet Israel as a state. It was a community, a very small community, that had returned to the land determinedly after 2,000 years of exile from the land, returning to the land that had formed the culture of the Jewish people, that culture encapsulated in the Bible. And I remember myself as a child of 8 in a pioneering settlement, given a spade and asked to direct the frothing waters through an irrigation furrow, bringing life to tender saplings. And that image remains with me, watching the water gurgling and softening the harsh clods and giving life to tender saplings. That image has shaped my life. And I had wonderful teachers at the time. And when I came back to this country where I was born and studied under marvelous teachers, for example, I studied at Rutgers University. I got my master's degree there at the age of 20. And among my teachers was Selman Waksman, who was a Nobel Prize winner for having developed streptomycin, which is and coining the term antibiotic. And he was able to isolate these curative substances from soil bacteria, from soil microbes, actinomycetes, and so on. And it all came from the observation that, and ponder this, since time immemorial, people and animals have died of all manner of disease and been buried in the soil. And yet the soil disinfects all of the pollution, somehow or other, all of the diseases. Not a single major disease is transmitted by the soil. The soil, we call it dirt sometimes, but by the way, any student of mine who called the soil dirt failed the course. Never refer to the soil as dirt. The soil is a fount of cleanliness. It is where all waste products are recycled and reformed into productive nutrients. And it is out of the soil that streptomycin and other antibiotics were synthesized. So the idea of dealing with the soil as a life-giving and life-sustaining medium is just a marvelous idea. And it's encapsulated, in fact, in history, in the name assigned to our species. And I'm repeating myself. Homo sapiens, wise earthlings. Homo comes from humus. And if I repeat this 10 times, it's still not enough. So if you walk out of here with any lesson at all, please remember that we are of the earth.
Great. You are a student of ancient civilizations. You've written about them, you've thought about them, you have appreciated them. Let's talk about agriculture and the dawn of civilization. Was the agricultural transformation that took place in the Middle East the dawn of human civilization?
Yes. Well, the story is that human beings, the human species, Homo sapiens, began in Africa, and some tens of thousands of years ago, not very long ago, perhaps 15, 20,000 years ago or so, began to move out of Africa and funnel north through the Middle East and across the Mediterranean, bypassing, surrounding the Mediterranean, and then settling in Europe, and then fanning out eastwards into Asia, and then, of course, across the Bering Straits, eventually into the Western Hemisphere. That process was very interesting, and much of it involved the development, the transformation of an animal that engaged in hunting, gathering, scavenging, eventually settling on the land and beginning to practice soil husbandry and domesticating animals such as the goat and the sheep, and eventually horses and camels and so on, and also domesticating plants. The early plants domesticated were wheat and barley and oats and rye. These were found growing wild, the progenitors of these species, growing wild on the hillsides in what is called the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent is that curve of rain-fed land that starts east of the Mediterranean and curves around the valley of the Nile, of the Tigris and Euphrates, all the way to the western part of what is today Persia, and even farther east. And that's where people who began as wanderers, scavengers, began to settle on the land and learn to domesticate the early progenitors of crops, which I mentioned, wheat and barley and oats and rye and so on and so forth, and then domesticating animals and beginning to form permanent settlements. And so, having lived in that part of the world, having observed that process and the location where it occurred, I and my contemporaries gained an appreciation of the early development of agriculture and the potentialities in making agriculture ever more productive, ever more efficient, and ever more conservative of resources such as the soil, the vegetation, and water, and the use of energy, of course. Animal energy, solar energy. That's what agriculture is.
You write about Egypt
Yes.
as a region that in the past was exempt from waterlogging and salinization and some of the other problems that plagued the Indus River Valley or the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates.
Yes.
But you indicate that Egypt's situation is now changing.
Yes.
What do you mean? What is happening in Egypt now and what needs to be done?
The story of Egypt is very, very interesting, very significant. As far as we know, archaeologists and historians have studied Egypt, early in the 19th century, around the turn of the 18th and 19th century, Napoleon invaded Egypt. And the story of his invasion of Egypt and the military campaign is of no lasting consequence. But what is very consequential is that he brought scientists with him who began to study Egypt, and they did the first survey and published it in the year 1805. The first survey of the land of Egypt and of the antiquity of Egypt. They deciphered the ancient Egyptian writing and began to uncover some of the antiquities and interpret them. It's very interesting. And they also did a census, the first modern census, counting the population of Egypt. And the population of Egypt then was about 2.75 million. And from what we understand, that was roughly the population of Egypt over the many centuries, the 5 millennia or so of Egyptian civilization, or the 4 millennia of Egyptian civilization. It would fluctuate up and down, perhaps in times of drought or pestilence, the population would fall to perhaps 1.5 million or 2. And then in times of plenty, it would rise perhaps to 3 or 4 million. But roughly it stayed in the same range. What do you suppose the population of Egypt is today?
5-10 times that?
More than that. The population of Egypt today is well over 80 million, 85 million, and growing. And what caused this change? What caused the change, of course, is the introduction of modern medicine and the control of disease and so on. And so the population began to grow, but the land and water base remained the same until way back in the 1950s, 60s, the Nile was dammed at Aswan. Earlier attempts were made to dam the Nile, but never on such a scale. And so it became possible now not merely to rely on the seasonal, spontaneous flooding of the land, but actually hold back the water behind the Aswan High Dam and feed the irrigation system perennially, year-round, so that the Egyptians can now produce not a single crop a year, but 2 or 3 or 4 crops in succession. And this, for a while, sustained the population of Egypt, but it continued to grow through the application of modern medicine and sanitation. And so, once again, Egypt in a crisis because of the population is now exceeding the productive capacity. So much needs to be done to curb uncontrolled population growth and at the same time to improve the management of agriculture so as to feed the population and also to provide them with a better way of life, a better mode of life. That's what we need to do not only in Egypt, that's only a particular case study, but you could repeat that in many other places where the population has grown beyond the capacity of the land to sustain. So we have to hold back the uncontrolled population growth by education, not by coercion, and also improve the productivity of agriculture sustainably. That's very, very important. To sustain the productive capacity of land and water.
I want you to pretend to be a time traveler. Okay? A time traveler. Knowing what you know about civilization, knowing what you know about climate change, and the problems that have led to the situations that we now worry over and must solve. If you could go back in time to any era, any time in history, where would you choose to go and what intervention would you make? Who would you talk to and tell them they have to stop doing what they're doing or start doing something?
I would choose to live in the present because there's a task in the present and there's promise in the present. I'm not a pessimist. I don't know what to do with pessimism. I know what to do with optimism. With optimism we can act, but it's conditional optimism. I'm optimistic that we can improve the way we manage our resources, the way we manage ourselves and our productive capacity and our mode of life. Less wasteful, more conservative, more responsible, more attuned to the multiplicity of life, to recognize that we are members of the community of life, an interdependent community of biodiversity, and manage the resources of the earth sustainably. So I wouldn't choose to be anywhere else but at the present time. I wish I could live longer, but perhaps I can live longer through young people who will learn a little bit from what I can impart to them, and this will be a way, this is the way teachers perpetuate themselves.
Sure.
And I'm something of a teacher, but I'm also really a lifelong student. That's the best answer I can give.
That's good. Let's talk about human nature. Human nature. As humans, we struggle, and we
Yes.
always have,
Yes.
with the wants and needs of ourselves as individuals
Yes.
versus the wants and needs of larger communities. Will human nature be our downfall or our salvation? In your view, is it possible for the compassionate and caring aspect of the human spirit to prevail over our tendency to exploit? How can we manage this duality and shift it in a productive direction?
Well, each of us goes through a process. When we're children, we're self-centered. We don't really see other people. We think only of ourselves. Children are naturally egotistical, shall we say. And gradually, as we mature, we begin to perceive that other people have needs and wants, and we learn to integrate. We socialize. The socialization process is part of maturation. Now, this process has to continue. And our circle or our sphere of inclusion, you know, we tend to divide the world into us and them. Us is our immediate circle. When we were living in caves, us was our clan. Anybody else approaching was a potential enemy. And gradually we coalesced to form villages, and then towns, and then states, and then regional associations, and our sphere of inclusion into the us category is expanded. Now that we think in terms of humanity, we have to think beyond in terms of the community of life on Earth, in terms of the biosphere. We've taken control of it. We're responsible for it. So it's all part of us. We're all integrated. We're all interdependent. So that's a lesson that we learn as we mature, not only individually, but as a civilization. Sphere of inclusion should include the biosphere.
I want to ask you about your perspective on the Middle East. So with regard to the Middle East, it has been written that the price of conflict is catastrophe, and the dividends of peace are immeasurable. What, in your view, are the prospects for peace in the Middle East, and how can peace be achieved? This is a hard question.
Well, I can also only speak in terms of hope. Conflict is mutually destructive. Nations that conflict destroy each other and destroy themselves. So instead of conflict and rivalry, there has to come regional cooperation. And it's a very promising possibility. Through regional cooperation, much can be done. Sharing the waters, learning ways of managing the land, exchanging products. Agriculture and industry can be complementary. Learning to share. Look at Europe. Until a generation ago, the Europeans over centuries fought each other, bled each other white. The Germans and the French fought each other every generation. Time and again, killing each other's youth. For what? Today, if you ask a young German or a young Frenchman or a young Italian, why did your father fight his father? Why did his grandfather fight and kill your grandfather? And so on. Since early times, they will shrug and say, we don't know. It was stupid. So now the Europeans have coalesced into a European community, and that's an example of what can and should be done in the Middle East and other parts of the world, and is in fact happening in Southeast Asia to some extent, South America, certainly North America. And so I see that this is a productive process. We're coming to our senses the world over, learning to cooperate and to act responsibly, and within our sphere of inclusion, not only to include our neighbors, but also to include the biosphere. And that's what scientists can contribute. And students who will become scientists, who are already budding scientists, can contribute in the coming decades. That sense of community.
Let's open the floor up to some questions from the audience. Okay, we've been talking up here 45 minutes, 55 minutes, so I want to give you a chance to ask questions. When we call on you to answer, someone will bring a microphone to you so that everyone can hear your question. Please also tell us your name and your affiliation so that we know who you are. So with that, I'll open the floor up to questions from the audience.
Or answers.
Or answers, yes. One in the back.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Becky Brill, and I'm just a member of the audience. My father was a horticulturist, so I had an interest from growing up. And in the past, when they created a new hybrid, it was done by taking the pollen from one plant and sprinkling it on another. Nowadays, they do it differently, and I wondered if you could comment on the genetically modified foods.
It's not my field, so I'm interested in it, but it's not the topic of my research, so I cannot really speak authoritatively about the process of genetic modification and development of new varieties. But there are dangers. There are certain dangers that we have to be mindful of, and I'm sure that scientists are mindful of. And that is that we can inadvertently produce perhaps new varieties of plants or microbes or insects or whatever it is that will in the end prove to be destructive rather than constructive. So we have to be very careful about this process of changing nature. We're playing God. But I believe that the scientists involved, some of whom I know, are indeed cognizant of these dangers, and they are taking the necessary precautions to develop what's been called synthesizing new varieties of plants, even new, in a way, new species by genetic manipulation. It has to be done very carefully. There's a new possibility here that is both promising and, in a way, dangerous. It has to be done very carefully. And I believe that it is done carefully, but it is always good to sound precaution, a precautionary note. So that's my answer. We're venturing into unknown territory. We're playing God in a way, creating new species or combining species in a way that can be very constructive and may, in some cases, be destructive. So let's be careful, very careful.
Question? Here's one over here, I think. Daniel, here's some water.
I'm Mahfouz Khan. I'm a graduate student here in the hydrogeology program. So my question is, what role groundwater can play in sustainable agricultural or agricultural sustainability in the context of population growth and climate change, given that groundwater pumping requires energy?
I'm going to ask you to repeat the question very slowly and speak up. We couldn't hear you.
Can you stand up, please, for a moment?
I'm sorry for that. So my question is, what role groundwater can play in sustainable agricultural production in the context of population growth and climate change, given that groundwater pumping requires energy?
Yes. Okay. This is a very good question, and it's right up my alley, and so I'm glad to try to answer this. Groundwater is an important resource. A great amount of water rests under the ground. It is replenished by rainfall and by rivers, by seepage, both vertical and lateral. It is an important source, provided that it is not extracted beyond replenishment. There are places, an example is the Ogallala Aquifer underlying the northern part of Texas and Kansas and Nebraska, that region in the western US. That's only one example of a place where groundwater is extracted in excess of its replenishment. And so the water table is falling, and that thriving irrigation district is putting itself out of business by overusing its water supplies. Part of the answer is to improve the efficiency of water use and also to reduce the area being irrigated to the extent necessary to maintain the resource. So, where groundwater is replenished sufficiently, or where it can be recharged effectively by diversion of rivers, seasonally, it can be a sustainable resource, a productive resource for irrigated agriculture. Where it is extracted beyond replenishment, beyond potential replenishment, it is depleted, and agriculture will quickly, within decades, put itself out of business. So that's something that we have to be very mindful of. Not to use the resource in excess, beyond capacity. I hope that answers the question.
Another question? There's one down here.
I'm Jeanette Miller from the Environmental Institute. We have a lot of undergraduate students in the audience and in our programs who are preparing for their lives and careers in environmental science. You have a lot of a geopolitical experience. I'm wondering, what would be a very fruitful experience for undergraduate students as they're preparing for their lives and their future? Apart from, the undergraduate degree, what else would be very important from your perspective?
I think part of our education system should be to encourage and help organize missions of students, pre-graduation or post-graduation, to different parts of the country and parts of the world, where they can see for themselves the processes that they've studied theoretically. The world exists outside of textbooks. It's there and here So field-oriented, reality-oriented education. A campus should not be self-enclosed, and campuses should be able to cooperate in sending out missions to various parts of the country and various parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and so on. And I believe that this is taking place not only in the context of the Peace Corps, such as aid missions, but study missions, constructive study missions. We are living in an integrated world, and we should integrate our education of students in the environmental and the agricultural sciences. The world should be our oyster, the entire world.
There's another question.
Hello, my name is Abina Dapa. I am a freshman studying 3 languages. And this past semester, I took a course on human geography, and I learned that deserts were expanding. Right now, currently, especially the Sahara Desert, that area is expanding. And I noticed that you mentioned that during your studies, you went to Israel and you were able to create farming conditions in an arid environment. So how can we apply those concepts and stop the process of desert expansion?
Okay. There's a process called desertification, which is the transformation of the regions outside the desert, semi-arid regions, gradual desiccation of these regions, gradual deterioration or diminution of their resources, turning them into effective deserts, expanding the desert in effect. This is a dangerous process. Now, it can be caused by natural processes of climate change, but mostly it is caused by human abuse of the land, overgrazing, cutting down trees, causing soil erosion, depleting the water supplies by excessive extraction, salinizing the land by excessive irrigation, and causing the concentration of salt. So we have to study what are the root causes in every region. Say in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there's a band called the Sahel, which is intermediate, a band that runs all the way from West Africa, all the way to East Africa. South of the Sahara. By the way, Sahara means desert. So when you say Sahara Desert, what you're saying is desert, desert. So just call it Sahara or Sahara. The Sahara has in effect been expanding. It's been expanding not so much because of climate change. Climate change is a recent phenomenon that's begun, but mostly because of the overgrazing and abuse and erosion and salinization of land areas that were productive in the past. We have to be very careful about that. I've worked in some of these areas, in the northern part of Nigeria, in Ghana, in the Sudan, parts of the Sudan, Darfur, and Kordofan, and that whole band of land south of the Sahara Desert, the Sahara meaning desert. So it's better management that will prevent desertification and degradation of land. And this should be done by international cooperation. We're all concerned about that. And indeed, the United Nations, Food and Agriculture Organization, United States Agency for International Development, and so on, various other organizations are active doing research and trying to help, but not sufficiently. More needs to be done to protect these vulnerable lands, which are semi-arid to arid. And the vegetation, the ecosystems are very fragile and subject to degradation. That's where we need to be very extra careful in international cooperation to properly manage the land and the vegetation and the biomes sustainably. That is a key word. If you walk out of here with any single word, I want you to walk out of here with the word sustainable. Let's manage the earth and its biotic resources and its biomes and its ecosystems sustainably. Beyond that, constructively, let's improve the land. It can be done more efficiently. Yes.
There's one here and one here.
Good evening. My name is Jason Begani. I am a senior of Resource Economics and Sustainable Development at Ag School. To pick on some of the points that you were saying, what do you think, at the University of Delaware more specifically, we have a thing called the Path to Prominence. What do you think our responsibility to build a live-in lab at the university to practice some of the things that we should be applying for sustainable practice? It's one thing to say, hey, you're going to get picked up and we'll drop you off halfway around the world. What do you think is our responsibilities as a university to actually build these live-in labs that we can start to practice?
Well, embedded in the word university is the concept of the universe. A university may be located here, but its outreach should be universal. Science is universal. There's no American science versus Russian science versus South American science. Science is truly encompassing. And the practice of science in the protection and enhancement of the Earth's living resources and living potential, that's universal. So we have to develop ways of exchanging information by visits, by work assignments, incorporating that sense of universality into our educational system, both theoretically and in practice. That's my answer. It's not an easy task. We have limited time and resources, and all of us are in a hurry to get on with our lives. But we have to expand our sphere of inclusion, individually and collectively. That's my answer, as best I can give. And in a sense, I've devoted my own career to this expanded view.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Marilyn, and several years ago in the Dead Sea, there was 3 hectares of land that was planted in a very saline, sandy earth, and there was really nothing that was growing there at all. However, Jeff Lawton applied the permaculture design of permaculture. So he created you may be aware of it, a 7-layer food system that became very, very lush, very, very quickly. The engineers there in that area were shocked. They thought it was much too saline of an environment there for anything to grow. And it was perennial and it was self-sustaining until the goats came back in a few years.
Where did this take place? Can you tell me?
Near the Dead Sea, and
Where?
there's a YouTube video of it. It is simply called Greening of the Desert,
Yes.
and it's wonderful. It's 2 parts, and it will show you the initial very easy installation.
Good.
And part 2, Jeff Lawton gives a prologue of it. But permaculture is a system that started 35 years ago by Bill Mollison and another man, and it basically refers to permanent agriculture. But since then, it's like a self-evolving database that also involves permanent financial systems, permanent cultures, the whole bit. And
Okay, can you name the site where this is?
I cannot name the site, but you can easily find the site. It's, I think, about 2 miles from the Dead Sea. You can find the site on YouTube by just...
In what direction? Is this in Israel or in Jordan?
You need, I believe, I am not sure, I believe it's in Jordan, and you need to go on YouTube and just search Greening of the Desert. It will give you that information,
Okay.
as well as the Permaculture Institute of Australia.
Okay, good.
But it applies permaculture anywhere in pretty much any climate, including a very harsh environment such as near the Dead Sea.
Good. Good. Well, the Dead Sea and its surroundings are an extreme climate. The Dead Sea is the lowest region on the Earth's continental surface. It's more than 400 meters below sea level. Very hot, very dry, and the Dead Sea is very, very, very saline. It's so saline that you can't sink in the water. You can sit in the water and be bobbed up by it. It's saturated with salt. So the periphery of the Dead Sea tends to be saline, but where there are tracts of land that can be leached of salts or that are relatively salt-free, bringing water and irrigating land is, though the conditions are extreme, still life can be brought there. So what you're telling us is a very encouraging development. On the Israeli side, I've been to the Jordanian side as well, but I'm not familiar with this site that you're talking about, but I am familiar with several settlements along the western side of the Dead Sea, such as in Gedi, where agriculture is being practiced and is very productive through the judicious use of water, leaching of the excess salts, and frequent application of small aliquots of water. That's very, very important to maintain a favorable condition. Infusing nutrients into the water and growing specialized crops that are adapted to these extreme conditions of temperature and the constant threat of salinity. So, yes, agriculture can be practiced even in extreme conditions. So, thank you for pointing this out.
There's a question in the front.
Hey, my name is Guy Kramer, Energy and Environmental Policy. I had a question. You mentioned sustainability is really important.
Yes.
And during this talk, you've talked about the need to increase productivity to meet the demands of increasing population. So my question is, how do we achieve sustainable development when the mindset of the people who set policy, the economists, the luminaries in the field, is that growth is both inevitable and necessary?
We have to change their mindset.
How would you go about doing that?
I would hope that it would be done in the way we're doing it now, by discussion, sometimes by argumentation, by information, by enlightenment. That's the function of a university, really, to be a fount of knowledge and understanding, by discussion, and if necessary, by legislation or whatever it is, or international agreements. Those are the mechanisms we have. We can't do it by coercion, but by persuasion, perhaps. Education. Trial and error, and retrial, and avoidance of error in the future. It is impossible to conceive of the world in terms of unbridled continued growth of the human population. We have to stabilize at some point, and at some point, now is a good point at which to begin to stabilize the world's population and our demand on resources. Otherwise, we're going to destroy, we're likely to, God forbid, destroy the productive capacity of the earth and condemn ecosystems to oblivion. We have to be responsible. Self-controlling is a major part of our responsibility. And in fact, there are signs that the Earth's population is beginning to stabilize. In many countries, we've achieved nearly zero population growth. Improve the standard of life, improve the quality of life, but not go on increasing our numbers and our demand on the Earth's finite and vulnerable resources.
There's a question right here and another one over here.
For 50 years, you've been having adventures. When you go to Africa, when you go to the Middle East, I would love to hear about some of the adventures of when you first started telling people that the drip way was a good way, and they said, no, we're not going to do that, or just any of these adventures that you've had. You must be full of stories.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I can tell many stories, but I'll tell just one now. Way back in, I think, the year 1981, I was sent by the World Bank to Pakistan, and I was traveling through the part of Pakistan that is desert, called Baluchistan. It is the northwestern part of Pakistan, abutting Afghanistan and Iran. And one day, traveling through the region, we came upon a farmer who was irrigating an orchard that he had just planted of fruit trees. And we saw that he was flooding the land, the way the people flood the land along the Indus River. But Baluchistan doesn't have a river. Baluchistan is the desert part of Pakistan. And so we stopped, and I engaged the farmer, and I asked him, what is he doing? He said, well, I planted these fruit trees, and now I'm watering them. And he was flooding the land with an enormous amount of water that he was drawing from a well. So I asked him if he thought all that water is necessary, and he said, yes, to grow big trees, we need big water. I said, well, might it be possible to grow big trees by applying the water one drop at a time, little amount of water, continuously? And he looked at my guide, who was interpreting. I don't speak Urdu or Pakistani. I'd learned a few words, but I didn't know any at that time. And he looked and he winked at my interpreter as if I'm crazy, sort of like this crazy man. Why did you bring this crazy man to me? And so I parted with him saying, it is possible, think about it, it is possible to grow beautiful fruit trees by irrigating one drop at a time. Well, 10 years passed, and the World Bank once again sent me into Baluchistan, where my responsibility was to introduce drip irrigation. And this time we happened to pass by the same orchard, and we saw these beautiful fruit trees. And the son of that old farmer was tending to these little plastic tubes and irrigating the fruit trees one drop at a time, dripping water. So I had the driver stop, and I walked out, and I asked the young man if his father is still around. And he said, "Oh yes, he's sitting there drinking tea." So I walked into the father, and he instantly recognized me, and his first words were, "By God, you were right 10 years ago. It is possible to grow trees one drop at a time." But he hadn't conceived of that because his idea of irrigation was derived from the river valley of the Indus River, where land has been flooded since time immemorial. That's the only kind of irrigation they knew, flooding the land. So there's an example, one of many that I can cite, of how the paradigm changes, the mindset changes. The idea of irrigation shifts from flooding land infrequently to applying the water like spoon feeding a baby, little by little, continuously, and much more efficiently and sustainably. So, and I've had many such experiences. Just one example.
One more question. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it a quick one. I'm a soil science major here, and just wondering
More
if
power to you.
Thank you. Just wondering if there's a single piece of advice you could offer somebody that's just starting their career.
Study. Young man, study. And apply. You're in the right field.
Very good.
More power to you. Upwards and onwards.
Very good. Our time has run out. I'd like to point out that there are some books on display, I believe, out front. I have one with me here that I've read several of Professor Hillel's books in the past few weeks. He is a master of language and of communication. You do not need to know soil physics, I can attest to that, to enjoy his perspective on the earth and what it's contributed to the dawn of civilization, the development of religion, the development of everything. And he has many perspectives that are timeless. So don't worry about the publication date of a book that you read. You will truly enjoy them. They are available. You can get ebooks for your Kindle, or you can probably buy many of them, several of them on Amazon. But I highly recommend them. He's a marvelous, marvelous writer. With that, I want to thank all of you for participating.
I have to interject here. A word of warning. There will be a test at the end of the semester.
You should make test reworks. Thank you all so much for participating and for your questions, and especially thank you, Professor Hillel, for joining us and for just sharing your thoughts and your ideas about the future. Thank you.